In some, not only was the Confederacy anti-democratic, they were stupid as well, and uh, they ended up getting nothing out of the French intervention into Mexico. Nothing of any anywhere close to what they hoped that it would lead to. So basically, they sold out Juarez and they sold out Republican government in neighboring Mexico and got nothing in return. Okay, so what's the story of Maximilian? Maximilian comes into Mexico. There's great pomp and circumstance. He is crowned Emperor of Mexico. His kingship is floats on the French army, about 35,000 men. And what you have between 1864 and 1867 is basically a guerrilla war against Maximilian. It's very similar to what you might have had in Mexico. I'm sorry, in Afghanistan when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s. Um, it's a successful guerrilla war. The French uh, really had bitten off far more than they could chew when they went into Mexico. You're just not going to capture Mexico with 35,000 troops, especially when the bulk of the Mexican population is so pro Juarez and pro democracy and anti Maximilian and anti Napoleon III. Um, so Maximilian he comes in. This war continues. Um, the French army or elements of the what we call the Imperial Army uh, do take Matamoros in the fall of 1864, and there's quite a bit of trade that goes on between northern Mexico and South Texas, but that had been going on for the entire period of the Civil War. So it wasn't anything new. It was just a continuation of a previous phenomenon. Juarez goes up into Monterrey, and then, as I said before, eventually all the way up into the very northern reaches of Chihuahua, near right across the river from El Paso, Texas. And then he's very frustrated. Juarez is very frustrated because although there's a lot of opposition and a lot of angry words in the Union about what Napoleon III has done in Mexico. As I said in a previous podcast, Lincoln had no desire to get into a war with Napoleon III, certainly not while the Civil War was going on. So Lincoln puts the Monroe. I have a friend who's a Mexican historian, and I was at a conference with her last summer, and she's pretty still mad at Lincoln for not helping the French or the Mexicans earlier. And she said to me, "What did Lincoln put the Monroe Doctrine in a drawer and just forgot where it was?" And anyway, she's still mad. So what happens is though. There is this opposition, a lot of stated opposition, public positions of anger. But Lincoln is saying, look, we can't do anything until the Civil War is over. Now, one of the real proponents of intervention into Mexico was none other than my old buddy U.S. Grant. U.S. Grant had fought in the Mexican-American War. He'd always felt very, very guilty about what the United States had done in Mexico in the 1840s. In his memoirs, he very, very famously said that the Mexican-American War of 1848 was the most unjust war ever waged by a stronger power against a weaker power. And he said that what the U.S. was doing was acting like the monarchies of Europe. So Grant, although he fought with great valor and great skill in the Mexican-American War, he's very critical of it in his memoir. And he has the Mexican ambassador, a guy by the name of Mateus Romero. He meets with him in 1864, about a year before the Civil War is over. And Grant tells Romero, look, what's going on in Mexico is horrible. It's really a threat against democracy in the entire hemisphere. I recognize that. And by the way, that's one of the things I really like about Grant. Lee would have never thought about Mexico in that way. Lee was very, very Virginia focused. Grant really thought much more globally. He thought much more transnationally than did Lee. And this is something that he almost never gets any credit for. So in the summer of 1864, he meets with the Mexican ambassador and says, look, once this war is over, once the Civil War is over, I will do everything in my power to help you. I can't do anything now because we're engaged in a very, very difficult struggle with the Confederacy. But once this thing is over, I'll do everything in my power to help you. And he keeps his promise. Grant keeps his promise. The Civil War ends, and we haven't talked about that yet, so don't get alarmed. But the Civil War ends in basically April of 1865. Lincoln is assassinated. Grant at this point is a national hero, and he's head of the Union Army. And immediately, and you know, Grant really moves quickly. After the Civil War is over, he sends tens of thousands of troops to South Texas. Now, I had talked about a Union occupation of South Texas in 1863, right before the Gettysburg Address. That had not really come to much. Lincoln had sent troops down there to kind of keep an eye on the French on the border, but they weren't in northern Mexico at this point. And ultimately, those troops withdraw to South Padre. And Brownsville, which had been captured by the Union Army in 1864, is recaptured by the Confederate Army. Brownsville, which had been captured by the Union Army in late 1863, by the summer of 1864, Brownsville is back in Confederate hands. Okay, fast forward, though, to the end of the Civil War, April 1865. Grant sends tens of thousands of U.S. troops to the border. Now, he's not going to invade Mexico. That's not part of his plan. But what Grant wants to do is he wants to keep his promise that he'd made to the Mexican ambassador. And so what he wants to do is he wants to intimidate the imperial forces, the army of Maximilian that is deployed to northern Mexico. So what he does is Grant sends Philip Sheridan, one of his most aggressive and successful generals, to the border immediately after the Civil War. Grant doesn't mess around. It's quite striking how quickly he sends U.S. troops to the border after the Civil War is over. For Grant, the conflict of the 1860s, what I talk about the wider conflict of the 1860s, the intertwined conflict between the French intervention and the Civil War, Grant really saw this as integrated conflicts. In some ways, as a single war. And for Grant, the end of the U.S. Civil War was not the end of the wider continental conflict that existed in the 1860s. So, long story short, for Grant, the crisis of the 1860s in North America is not over until the French are kicked out of Mexico. That's really what it amounts to. He backs up his belief with actions. He sends tens of thousands of Union troops immediately after the U.S. Civil War is over, after the Confederate surrender is over. And what he wants to do is he wants to put a maximum amount of pressure on the Imperial Army in northern Mexico. So what happens is these U.S. troops, go to the border. They bring with them tens of thousands of guns that they don't need anymore. They put these guns in warehouses right along the Rio Grande. And what happens is U.S. Army officials tell Juarez's army in northern Mexico, they have good relations with them, they're coordinating with them, they're talking, and they say, look, there's a warehouse in Eagle Pass, and there's 10,000 weapons in that warehouse, and it's not locked. and it's not going to be guarded. And so basically, what Grant does, and we don't know the exact figures, but we think that Grant might have supplied the Mexicans fighting the French, the Waista army, up to 50,000 weapons. We're not sure, but it might have been up to 50,000 weapons that he is sending into Mexico by just letting the Mexican army, Juarez's army, know that they're there. They're just there waiting for them, that the U.S. troops are looking the other way, and that they're there for them to take. There's ammunition as well. So what happens is that the Waista army, which had been terribly supplied up until the end of the Civil War, suddenly has as many guns as it knows what to do with. So once again, we have this interconnections between the Civil War and the French intervention into Mexico, because the end of the Civil War was a major victory for Juarez, because what it did was it allowed for the flow of tens and tens and tens of thousands of weapons from the United States into Mexico. This had not occurred before the Civil War is over, because Lincoln had slapped a very strict embargo on the selling of weapons into Mexico. But now Lincoln's dead, now the Civil War is over, and suddenly that embargo is lifted. So Juarez's army, and I have evidence that some of the troops that were fighting the Imperial Army were actually using bow and arrow because they had no other weapons. Suddenly now, the army under Benito Juarez, especially in northern Mexico, but soon throughout Mexico, is very well supplied with armaments, which is really bad news, of course, for the French.